The fire in the archives, it began not with a discovery, but with a fire. At 2:47 a.m., the shriek of an alarm tore through the silence of the Colonial History Archives in North Carolina. In the basement, where the air was thick with centuries of dust, parchment, and forgotten stories, a thin column of smoke rose like a ghost from the floor. Within minutes, it had triggered the sprinklers, flooding the old storage room with freezing water that mixed with the smell of smoke and burning wood. Dr. Ava Mitchell, one of the youngest historians ever to work at the archives, arrived barefoot, coat half buttoned, her flashlight slicing through the fog. Her mind was racing. The basement held irreplaceable materials, private donations, rare manuscripts, centuries, old documents too fragile to be digitized. But the fire was spreading. It hissed across wooden crates, licking the edges of history itself. And then she saw it, a metal container in the corner, untouched by the flames. Around it, the Blackwood collection was disintegrating, its wooden cases collapsing into ash and ember. Ava didn't think. She ran toward the blaze, threw her jacket over her mouth, and sprayed the extinguisher until her arms shook. Smoke clawed at her lungs. Sparks bit at her hands. When the beam above her cracked and crashed, she dove aside, clutching the metal box to her chest like it was alive. When firefighters pulled her out 20 minutes later, she was drenched, coughing, trembling, but she refused to let go of the container. The archivists gathered outside in the cold, watching as paramedics checked her for burns. But Ava's attention was locked on what she'd saved. The old collector, Edmund Blackwood, had donated the crate only 2 weeks ago. He'd said, with a cryptic smile, that it contained fragments of a forgotten expedition. She hadn't believed him, not until that night. In the parking lot, beneath flashing red lights and drifting smoke, Ava knelt beside the sealed container. The metal was warm, tarnished with age but intact. She opened it slowly, her breath fogging in the air. Inside was oiled leather, wrapped tightly around something flat. When she unrolled it under her flashlight, her pulse quickened. It wasn't parchment. It wasn't a letter. It was a drawing, finely detailed, astonishingly preserved. Men in 16th-century armor stood beside a massive oak tree. On the bark, carved deep into the grain, were the letters every American historian knew by heart: croatoan, the word tied to one of the greatest unsolved mysteries in history, the lost colony of Roanoke. Ava held the drawing closer. The detail was extraordinary. You could see the rivets in the armor, the leather of their boots, the tilt of their helmets. Behind them, wooden chests lay open, as though being packed for departure. Far in the distance, ships floated on calm water, their sails gleaming with dawn light. Her hands began to shake. This wasn't just a generic depiction. It looked real. It looked eyewitness. And then she noticed something else. Something that froze her blood. Beneath the word croatoan were faint, smaller carvings. Letters, words, half swallowed by time. She whispered into the night, "There's more text." By sunrise, Ava was in her lab at the archives, still soaked, her hair tied back, magnifying lenses strapped over her eyes. Every inch of the drawing defied expectation. The material wasn't paper or animal skin. It felt smoother, tougher, some kind of early cellulose mix unknown in the 1500s. The ink pigments reacted oddly to light. Some lines shimmered faintly under UV, suggesting layered techniques centuries ahead of their time. This was no crude sketch. It was a masterwork, created by someone who understood optics, detail, and possibly encoding. She knew she needed a second opinion. By noon she had called the one person who could help her. Dr. James Parker, professor of early colonial history at Duke University, the leading expert on the Roanoke mystery. When she described what she'd found, there was silence on the other end. Then James said 6 words that changed everything. Ava, stop touching that drawing immediately. 2 hours later, she arrived at Duke with the container locked inside a humidity-controlled case. James met her in his lab, his expression caught between disbelief and awe. "Please tell me this is a replica," he muttered, sliding on gloves. Ava shook her head. "It survived a fire, a flood, and 4 centuries. That's all I can tell you." They placed the drawing under a high-resolution microscope, the kind used for forensic document examination. What they saw was beyond anything either had encountered. The ink lines weren't uniform, they layered, dark over light, suggesting that the artist had drawn and redrawn certain sections with incredible precision. James adjusted the focus and frowned. This carving technique. Look at the lettering. Ava leaned in. The strokes of the C and R weren't drawn, they were etched, like impressions pressed into the medium itself. It's consistent with late 16th century engraving, James murmured. The sort used by navigators and mapmakers, not artists. Then it could have been drawn by someone from the colony itself, Ava said quietly. James nodded, eyes still fixed on the tree bark in the image. But what's strange is these smaller marks. See that? Below croatoan. She magnified the lower section until the image filled the monitor. Tiny, uneven letters appeared, faint, almost erased by age. They looked hurried, carved with a dull blade, and partially covered by what appeared to be natural bark regrowth. There's definitely more text, Ava whispered. And it's not random. Let's call Maria, James said suddenly. Professor Maria Rodriguez, a specialist in digital imaging and spectral analysis, arrived that evening. Her scanning equipment looked more suited to a NASA cleanroom than a history lab. We use this to study planetary photographs, she explained, calibrating the sensors. If there's hidden text, this will find it. The machine swept over the drawing, capturing data across ultraviolet, infrared, and thermal spectrums. The image came alive in layers. Beneath the surface lines, faint underdrawings appeared, ghostly blue shapes, as if the artist had mapped out the scene in stages. Maria leaned forward. This isn't just a drawing. It's a composite, multiple layers fused together. Whoever made this was using techniques centuries ahead of documented practice. Ava stared. You're saying this was deliberate? Maria nodded. Absolutely. Look. Even the shadows in the image were layered using mineral-based ink. That was unheard of in the 1500s. The computer beeped. Enhancement complete. As the processed image stabilized, the lab fell silent. Beneath croatoan, smaller letters glowed in false color, a hidden inscription weathered but unmistakable. Maria zoomed in. Her voice trembled. It says, "Dare stones mark the way. Follow beneath August moon." The room went utterly still. Ava's mind raced. Dara as in Eleanor Dare. Virginia Dare's mother? James nodded, his face pale. The same. The first English child born in America. And the Dare stones. Those carvings found in the 1930s. The ones historians called fakes. Ava turned to her laptop, pulling up archived records. 1937 through 1941 found across North Carolina and Georgia. Each stone had carved messages supposedly left by Eleanor Dare herself. She scrolled through the images. Weathered stones, marked with words that read like a journal of survival tales of death, migration, and integration with native tribes. For decades, scholars dismissed them as hoaxes. The language was too modern, the preservation too perfect. But now, with this drawing, what if they weren't hoaxes? James whispered. Ava stared at the enhanced image. What if this drawing was the key? A map that pointed to the stones. Maria brought up another section of the scan. There's something else. Look at the lower corner of the tree trunk. There, carved faintly beneath centuries of bark detail, was a date.